Hello folks, welcome to my YouTube channel, Watercolor Impressions. This is continuation of Absolute Beginner series in watercolors. This week we are going to learn how to create depth distance in watercolors. Before we go, hit the subscribe button so you guys can get weekly video updates. And let's get started, guys. As always, I'll provide the practice and reference templates. Check the video description to download it. When we try to create a depth distance in watercolors, the one important thing we have to keep in mind is to in distance, we use a lot of cool colors. For the foreground, we use warmer colors. For distant objects, we can use a lot of cool colors like Cobalt Blue, Cerulean Blue, French Ultramarine Blue, and any other cool blues work for it. And in the foreground, we use red warmer colors. For example, burnt amber, amber, or sepia, and you can use a little bit of cadmium orange in it to get the warmer tones in it. The other way we can create distance is to add a lot of details in the foreground than the distant objects. As the painting recedes, you could add lesser and lesser details, and that also create distance. There's also other ways we can create distance, but let's see a demo and we can go from there. I kept my drawing really simple because this painting is not going to be super pretty. I won't add that many details because I'm going to show how to create depth and distance in watercolors. So let's start with the sky. For the sky, I'm using Cobalt Blue, and I'm using a lot of water in my brush. And you can see, and I also have a little bit of water waiting for me. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to bring it all the way down till it meets the horizon. And I'm also making sure to keep it really light because I want to push the sky and the background really far. So as it comes down, I'm going to warm up the wash, and that will give a little bit of glow in our sky in distance. So that also creates a little bit of depth as well. So as it comes down, so now I'm going to take that shape, what we painted, and I'm going to connect that with the midground water. So for that, I'm going to use Cobalt Turquoise and a little bit of Cobalt Blue in it. And I'm also trying to keep it really light, because whenever things are in distance, I release a lot of water and it fades out, and it gives a little bit of distance and depth in our painting. And you can see I'm keeping it really light, and I've also left some white bits for the boats and which is in the dogs. So as it comes to the foreground, so I'm going to increase the pigment consistency by introducing a little bit of warmer tone because that gives a little bit of glow in the midground. So now let's connect the midground water with the foreground. Even though in the beginning I said that in the foreground we have to introduce a lot of warmer colors, but in this case, since we are painting water, we have to introduce a lot of cooler tones in there. So in this case, what we're going to do, we're going to increase the pigment consistency to show the distance. So what I will do, I won't have a lot of water in my brush, but I will have a lot of paint in my brush. So I'll create a gradient with a darker pigment at the bottom, because every pigment in watercolors, if you have a lot of water in your brush, it will have a lesser value. If you have less water in your brush, it will have a darker value in it. So for example, if you're using Cobalt Blue, and if you use with a lot of water, it will be on the value scale of 2. And if you would have used with less water, it will be on the value scale of 8. So that way we can create a gradient from top to the bottom. And you can see we created a lot of darker pigment at the bottom. I'm also introducing a little bit of neutral tint because I want to make sure that this comes to the foreground, the water comes to the foreground. I'll let the painting dry for a bit. Let's start with the background building, and I want to make sure that this goes in distance. So I'm going to be having a lot of water in my brush, and I'm using a little bit of Cerulean Blue and a little bit of Cobalt Blue, and I'm mixing a little bit of white paint in it so that it goes in distance. And this building, it's the same thing. I'm using Cobalt Blue and a little bit of white paint in it and a little bit of French Ultramarine Blue so that I can have a different variation of buildings at the background. So I'm going to do the same thing here. For this one, I'm using a little bit of green in that because like in distance there's a lot of trees there. So I'm using Cobalt Blue and a little bit of green. For green, I'm using a little bit of Viridian, and I'm also using a little bit of white paint in it so that the consistency is not that darker. But keeping in mind, I'm also using a lot of water in my brush so that once it dries out, the background fades away and it goes in distance. And you can see I'm not putting any details at all. I'm just like creating shapes as it is. And I also created a little bit of distance building too with a lot of water in my brush. And at the bottom, I want to anchor this background on the water. So I'm introducing a little bit of French Ultramarine Blue and a little bit of white paint in it and a little bit of burnt amber in it to have some color variation. And I connected that. For the boards, I don't worry about the boards now. So this is going to act as a mid-ground object. So I'll just keep it really simple and fast. And I'm not going to add that many details because we are creating and painting how to create depth and distance. Being said that, when it comes to mid-ground, your value should be darker than your background. But in reality, it will be other way around because traditional painting is all about creating depth and distance. But in reality, sometimes the background might be darker too. I went ahead and I finished all the mid-ground details for the boards, and now let's create a strong foreground element. And I want this value to be super darker, so I'm creating I'm mixing a neutral tint with a little bit of burnt amber in it, and I'm going to get as dark as possible. So as soon as we did this darker value in the foreground, you can see there is a three shape in this painting. There's a foreground, there's a midground, there's a background. And you can see in the foreground the value is darker, in the midground it has like a midtones, and in the background you can see it resists in the distance. If you take a black and white picture of this, and you can see the value is really good in this painting. So being said that, the foreground element kind of fade out, so I'm going to glaze over with a lot of French Ultramarine Blue with a neutral tint in it, so that it creates that depth from foreground, from midground to the background. So let's add some reflections for the trees, and this is the glazing I was talking about in the foreground. So I'm going to mix a lot of darker blue, and I'm just going to create that foreground element, and voila, and this painting is done. Let's apply the same concepts what we did in the previous painting, and this painting it's going to be a little bit different because I'm going to do a cityscape. This reference was taken near Liberty Village. I was going for my morning coffee and I saw this place, and I thought this would be a really good picture for creating depth and distance. Being said that, I always keep my drawing as simple as possible. So from what we learned, so we're going to be introducing a lot of cool blue colors in distance, and we're going to introduce a lot of warmer colors in the foreground. So for the sky, and it's going to be super simple, and I'm also speeding in 4 times faster, so don't get discouraged watching this video. So for the sky, I'm using Cobalt Blue, and for the foreground, and I'm introducing rare amber and a little bit of yellow ochre in it. And I'm also creating a really like a stronger lead in, so for that I'm using burnt amber in the foreground. And I'm also taking my clean brush and taking some paint away to show that there is roads. So now let's focus on the distance. For the distance, the same thing. I'm using Cobalt Blue and a little bit of white paint in it, so that I'm getting my value as light as possible. And you can also see, as I said at the beginning, in the background, don't add that many details. Keep it really simple, because in the foreground we're going to be adding a lot of details. So that also shows depth and distance in our painting. So I'm also trying to connect all the shape as possible. I'm also putting a little bit of value at the bottom because there's going to be a lot of shadows from the ground, because all the buildings are anchoring on the ground, so there's going to be a little bit of shadow bouncing from the ground. So I'm also taking that shape and connecting to a tree, and for the tree in the midground I'm also keeping my values really simple and lighter as well. But as it comes to the foreground, I'm going to increase the pigment consistency. And for the trees, I'm also introducing a little bit of mid-tone at the bottom. And you can see in the foreground tree, I'm introducing a lot of pigment consistency in there. So there's going to be less water in my brush, and there's going to be a lot of pigment in my brush. But as it comes down, and I also introduce a little bit of darker tone for the trees. So now I'm focusing on the foreground building. And you could see I'm introducing warmer colors in the foreground building. So as soon as we added that, the foreground building came in the front and the background went in distance. Being said that, I'm also mixing a little bit of cadmium orange in my burnt amber and rare amber for the foreground building. And I also introduce a little bit of car, so that I also want to show a little bit of perspective in my painting. And I'm also introducing a little bit of light poles in the foreground as well, and I'm doing as dark as possible so that it comes in the foreground. Let's add some secondary and tertiary details now. So I added a little bit of details for the foreground building, and I'm also trying to add some shadows now. For the shadows, I'm using neutral tint and a little bit of burnt amber in it, and you can use any kind of warmer colors to create shadows. But when you create shadows, I'm trying to make sure that the shadows look darker in the foreground, but as it goes in the distance, it gets lighter and lighter. And I'm happy with everything else, but the foreground building got really weak, and I want the foreground building to read and come in the front as much as possible. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take burnt amber and a little bit of cadmium orange and a little bit of raw amber, and I'm going to mix really thick as possible, then I'll glaze over it. As soon as we glazed over it, you could see the foreground building came in the front. Thanks again for watching this how to create depth and distance in watercolors. Let me know what you guys learned from this video in the comment section. Before you go, hit the subscribe button so you guys can get weekly video updates from our channel. And good luck with your painting, folks.